This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 419 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So I try to put myself out there each week on this show. I don't want to hold back my honest thought on players in fantasy football. I'm going to get things right, and I'm going to get things wrong. Like last week. Last week, one of the transactions was to sell Nick Chubb. And then Chubb had a great game in week 3. Of course, I realize that transaction doesn't look very intelligent in hindsight. And I don't like giving bad advice. Some fantasy analysts don't care. I care. I want you guys to win. But don't think that if I ignore talking about Chubb, or if I seem to talk about something that I did get right, don't think I'm just trying to talk about what I want to talk about and ignore the things that I get wrong. Because at the end of each season, I go through the things that I got right and the things that I got wrong. They each get their own podcast episode. If Chubb continues his pace, and if he finishes as an RB1 when I thought that he was an RB2, I'll talk about that and where things went wrong. I'm not an analyst that's going to hide from his mistakes. I'll defend myself if I'm being misinterpreted and misrepresented, which I have to do sometimes. But you don't get into this business without understanding that you're going to miss a whole lot of predictions. But in order for me to give you good advice and to be right, I'm going to have to be wrong. That's just the nature of how this works. Just keep in mind that I'll go through all of my hits and misses at the end of the year. I don't shy away from talking about the things that go south because that's what helps us become better at this game that we all love. Now, before getting into the transactions this week, I want to remind you about the Ringers Mega Contest. It's easy. Just make 5 picks against the spread, including 1 double down every single week. The top 100 users at the end of the season will then compete for the $25,000 in prizes during the playoffs. And the best part is, it's free to enter. To enter for free, visit playfree.fanduel.com/theringer. Eligibility restrictions apply. Add Justin Jefferson. So you guys remember before the season where I was into Irv Smith because Minnesota didn't have a locked-in number 2 pass catcher. Clearly that's not going to be Irv Smith. He's not going to be a thing this year. Or I don't think he will. But Justin Jefferson looks like that dude. And he was the logical player to be that guy. He had the best ADP outside of Adam Thielen on that team as a pass catcher. I like Justin Jefferson a lot as a prospect, so I'm very excited about his emergence in week 3. He watched his snap share rise from 54% in week 2 to about 79% on Sunday. And that translated to a 36% target share. And he also had 128 air yards, which was a top 15 number across the league. Now, we can't expect that type of usage week in and week out from Justin Jefferson. But it's going to be tough for the Vikings to hold Jefferson back after this performance. And maybe best of all, they get 3+ matchups over their next 3 games. They're going to face the Texans, Seahawks, and Falcons. So to me, Justin Jefferson is your number 1 wide receiver add this week. Hold James Robinson. Look, you guys know that I'm sort of a James Robinson truther. I liked him a lot as a prospect. I talked about him on this show back in April and May. So I don't think that his start to 2020 is some fluke. He's looked really good. And now he ranks well into the top half of the league in efficiency according to NumberFire's expected points model. That was a mouthful. But he's been good. That's basically what I want to say here. There is some reason for concern, though. He's an undrafted rookie, and usually undrafted rookies don't perform that well. And more competition will eventually be in that Jacksonville backfield. But the reason I wanted to have this transaction this week is because he had this big Thursday night performance, and some people may be wondering if they should sell him. And the answer to that is no, I don't think so. Because upcoming for the Jags are games against the Bengals, Texans, and Lions. Those are the top 3 teams in running back rushing yards allowed so far this year. With almost 92% of the team's running back rushes and a target share above 10%, Robinson should continue to be a very, very usable fantasy asset. Drop Carson Wentz. Guys, Carson Wentz has been awful. He's been terrible. He just looks lost on the field. And that's translated to fantasy football. He's ranked as a low-end QB2 through 3 games. And those have been against legitimately beatable defenses. In week 1, Wentz had 13 fantasy points against Washington. Over their next 2 games, the football team allowed a 32-point outing to Kyler Murray and a 14-point one to Baker Mayfield this past weekend. Then in week 2, Wentz scored a little over 12 points against the Rams. Now, the Rams have faced tough quarterback competition outside of that game this year, but that was easily the lowest point total that they allowed this year. And then in week 3, you get Cincinnati. You think finally Carson Wentz is going to come through with a strong fantasy performance. And he kind of did, but he didn't do it with his arm. He did it with his legs. 12.5 of his 21.5 points came from the ground. He is still not getting it done as a passer, and that's really, really concerning. And there's not a lot of hope coming, because over the next 3 weeks, the Eagles get the 49ers, the Steelers, and the Ravens. Now, a lot of people might think that the 49ers are beatable because they have so many injuries across that defense. But let me ask you this. Are you going to confidently play Carson Wentz this week against the 49ers? The answer to that is absolutely not. So if you're not going to play him against the 49ers, then all of a sudden, let's say that he has a decent game. Are you going to play him against the Steelers and the Ravens? No. In most leagues, Carson Wentz can be dropped. Buy Will Fuller and Brandon Cooks. The Texans had an atrociously tough schedule to start the season. They had Kansas City, then Baltimore, and then Pittsburgh. All 3 of those teams ranked well above average in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers last year. And I don't think it would be surprising at all if they were some of the best teams against wide receivers this year. That portion of the schedule for the Texans is now done. Now the Texans get to face the Vikings and the Jags over the next 2 weeks, and they don't really have a scary wide receiver matchup until like late November. That means that you should be buying the Texans pass catchers. So let's start with Will Fuller. He was injured in week 2, but in weeks 1 and 3, Fuller saw a 32.3% and an 18.5% target share. And he had 2 usable performances. He's going to be tougher to acquire, but I do think he is worth it right now given this tough portion of the schedule is now out of the way. But to me, I think Brandon Cooks is a better value to trade for right now. He's been relatively silent production-wise, but he's had almost a 20% target share so far this year with a nearly identical average depth of target to Will Fuller. He's just not getting the same type of buzz. So he's going to be easier to acquire. I just think that overall we should be bullish on this passing attack moving forward. Add Jordan Akins. And speaking of this Texans passing attack, Jordan Akins is getting a lot of run this year. He ranks in the top 10 in routes run at the tight end position, that's according to Pro Football Focus, and he's seen a decent enough 13% target share. That's a top 20 number at the tight end position. Again, the schedule is opening up for Houston. They should start to score more points. So I think that Jordan Akins could go from being a streamer to being a potential every week starter. Add Brandon Ayuk. So another rookie wide receiver with a big week 3 was Brandon Ayuk. He played 72% of San Francisco's snaps for the second straight week, and he scored over 21 PPR points. In week 2, Ayuk had about an 11% target share. In week 3, that was about 23%. I'm all about this. Maybe this had something to do with Nick Mullins being under center. Or maybe it had something to do with Raheem Mostert not playing in that game. Because Ayuk did get 3 carries on the ground, and he scored on one of those carries. But regardless, it's tough to ignore Ayuk's fit in this offense. He's a yards after the catch wide receiver. He can be a bully. And that's exactly what works in this Kyle Shanahan offense. So I'm pretty high on Ayuk moving forward. Sell JuJu Smith-Schuster. Now look, there's lots and lots of love, and there should be lots and lots of love for JuJu Smith-Schuster out there. He's fun, he's got a great personality, and he has one of the best age-adjusted career beginnings that we've seen at the wide receiver position. And thus far, he's lived up to expectation in fantasy football. He's been a wide receiver 1 through 3 weeks. But that's sort of why I'm selling him right now. One of the issues for JuJu so far is that the Steelers have spread the ball around. Now, Deontay Johnson was easily leading the team in targets before he got a concussion in week 3. But James Washington and Chase Claypool currently combined for over 22% of Pittsburgh's targets. And we saw Eric Ebron with a season-high 20% target share in week 3. Because there's a lot of good pass catchers in this offense, JuJu's target share is currently under 18%. Among top 20 wide receivers right now in fantasy football, only Mike Evans and Allen Lazard have lower target shares. Now, this obviously means that JuJu's just getting by on touchdowns. And he kind of is. He's scored 3 times this year despite ranking well outside the top 30 in receiving yards. Yards correlate to touchdowns. And over the last decade, it's taken wide receivers on average 164 yards to score a touchdown. JuJu's current rate is a touchdown on every 53 yards. Now, I would feel fine about JuJu if he was getting lots and lots of targets in the red zone and in the end zone, or if he was getting targets down the field. We want high average depth of targets for our wide receivers, and we want them to score touchdowns. That hasn't exactly been the case for JuJu, though. He does have 2 end zone targets, but he still ranks outside the top 15 within that statistic. And when it comes to air yards, we're not seeing them for JuJu. He's got one of the lowest average depth of targets among all relevant wide receivers, and he's outside the top 100 among all skill position players in total air yards. It's just unlikely that he's going to be able to maintain his current touchdown rate given the way that Pittsburgh is using him. I think that the way people are viewing JuJu is way higher than how they should be valuing him. Add Rex Burkhead and Damian Harris. Rex Burkhead went off in week 3. That was one of the biggest surprises of week 3. He had 6 carries, 49 rushing yards, a pair of touchdowns on the ground, and then he had 10 targets, 7 receptions, and 49 receiving yards, and then a receiving touchdown. Now, it's tough to buy into something like this happening again, because James White wasn't playing in this game. He was out because of that horrible, horrible family tragedy that he's dealing with. If White was in, this outing for Burkhead likely does not happen. I do think he's worth an add this week, but don't sleep on Damian Harris from this same New England backfield. He was getting buzz throughout the summer, don't forget that, but he's been sidelined with a hand injury to start the season. But this week he's able to come off injured reserve. And just given how the New England backfield is so muddied, he's at least got a shot to take over. Now we know how the Patriots backfield has operated historically. I don't think that probability is in Damian Harris's favor to actually take over that backfield. But it's in his range of outcomes. And that's what makes him worth a speculative add. And I think that if you're thinking about long-term viability, I would probably be adding Damian Harris over Rex Burkhead this week. Maybe that's a hot take, but it's truly how I feel. Add T. Higgins. So I talked about T. Higgins as the 16th transaction last week, and things really came to fruition fast. In week 3, Higgins caught 5 of 9 targets for 40 yards and 2 touchdowns. But aside from the touchdowns, aside from his production, the most important thing about this performance was his peripheral numbers. He played the most snaps at wide receiver for Cincinnati, and he ran the most routes, and he had the second highest target share. Every peripheral number has shifted up for T. Higgins week over week. He should be rostered in most fantasy leagues moving forward. Buy DJ Moore. So I sent a tweet on Sunday night in response to a mention, and it said, the DJ Moore hate is strictly the result of 0 touchdowns. He's currently 9th among wide receivers in yards. That was met with some backlash. But it told me that even though this is a repeat transaction from a previous week, I still think it needs to be stated. DJ Moore's peripheral numbers actually look pretty freaking good right now. He's one of just a handful of players with a target share above 25%, and he's got 239 air yards, which is a top 10 number in the league. He just hasn't scored. And even though he's seen just 1 target from within his opponent's 10-yard line, he's been targeted 3 times in the end zone this season. That's one of the higher marks in the NFL. It's higher than the aforementioned JuJu Smith-Schuster. So just to reiterate, I'm bringing up Moore because people seem very frustrated with his performance through 3 weeks. And I get it. He's not winning you weeks right now. And his wide receiver teammate, Robbie Anderson, who went undrafted in a lot of leagues, he's outperforming him. That's frustrating, but just be patient. There are better days ahead. Add Carlos Hyde. So there's a chance that Chris Carson does play here in week 4 against Miami. He had a knee bruise in that game against Dallas. Now, it's great that Seattle's optimistic, but number 1, there's still a chance that he doesn't go. And number 2, the Seahawks are touchdown plus favorites against the Dolphins this weekend, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. So if Chris Carson isn't totally 100%, they could easily just split that backfield up and give Carlos Hyde the rock, especially if they have a lead. Carlos Hyde has been the number 2 running back there, and he could get more run than usual this week if Chris Carson misses some time. Add Scotty Miller, Justin Watson, and Tyler Johnson. So Chris Godwin is now dealing with a hamstring issue, and that could bring more opportunity to the other wide receivers in this offense. The problem is picking up a wide receiver in this offense is not the simplest thing in the world. We fortunately have a one-game sample already this year of Chris Godwin not playing because he had that concussion in week 2. Justin Watson was actually one who benefited most from Chris Godwin not being on the field. And it's because Godwin plays a lot of his snaps from the slot. He's played 72.4% of his snaps from that area of the field this year, according to Pro Football Focus. Justin Watson is a slot guy, so he's the player who benefits. In that week 2 game without Godwin, Watson spent a similar number of snaps in the slot. The problem is Justin Watson has a shoulder injury. He didn't play on Sunday. And that led to Tyler Johnson. Remember that guy? The ultra-productive rookie wide receiver? He got some action against Denver. He played 31% of the team's snaps. So if Justin Watson were to miss week 4, Tyler Johnson could be the starting slot receiver for Tampa Bay. So that leaves us with Scotty Miller. His snap share might not rise dramatically without Chris Godwin, but he'll probably have more opportunity to see targets. So depending on your league size, all 3 players should be on your radar this week. I think that Scotty Miller is probably the safest to add, but if Godwin's expected to miss more than just this week, then the slot guys are also in play, and you can probably get them for pretty cheap. Sell Adrian Peterson. So as annoying as the Patriots' backfield is that I talked about earlier, the Lions might have the most obnoxious backfield in the entire NFL, at least for fantasy purposes. During the first 2 weeks of the season, DeAndre Swift led that Detroit backfield in snap rate. On Sunday, Swift was on the field for just 9% of the team's snaps. Adrian Peterson, meanwhile, had 60% of the team's snaps and 88% of the team's running back rushes. That rush share was one of the highest marks in week 3. You've got to be kidding me. Typically this would be a sign of good things to come for Adrian Peterson. But because this backfield has already just been so unpredictable, there's been such a rotation of running backs, I'm staying as far away from this situation as I possibly can. Maybe I would trade a bench player for DeAndre Swift, just for the upside. But at this point, you can't reasonably trust these running backs week in and week out. Add Ryan Fitzpatrick. I love Ryan Fitzpatrick this week. The Seattle defense has not been very good this year. No team has allowed a higher net yards per attempt rate, and only the Falcons have given up more fantasy points to the quarterback position. Yes, there's some noise in those statistics, but it's a beatable defense. Now enter Ryan Fitzpatrick. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Dolphins are 6.5-point underdogs this week, and the game has a 54-point over-under. There should be plenty of scoring, and after 2 straight strong performances from Fitzpatrick, I'm into him this week. I think he's the top streamer. Add the Denver Broncos defense. Just play a defense against the Jets. It's really that easy. The Broncos are 3-point favorites this week. The game against the Jets has a 39.5-point over-under. We saw what the Jets offense did for the Colts defense this past week. You're streaming defenses against the Jets week in and week out, and the Denver Broncos are currently widely available. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is pretty similar to last week. It's to add Olamide Zaccheaus, Chase Claypool, and Gabriel Davis. These are all adds based on injury, but I think that Claypool and Davis are decent stashes. Now on Sunday, Russell Gage left the Falcons game with a concussion. The same happened with Deontay Johnson for the Steelers. That allowed Zaccheaus to see a 16% target share, and Claypool went from a 30% snap share in week 1 to a 37% snap share in week 2 to a 76% snap share in week 3. So just keep an eye on those injuries. And keep an eye on the injury to John Brown too. He hurt his calf in Sunday's game. And that helped Davis go from a 49% snap share in week 1 and a 36% snap share in week 2 to a 74% one in week 3. So that's Olamide Zaccheaus, Chase Claypool, and Gabriel Davis. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I will be back tomorrow with the 10 Trends episode.